In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at early English settlement in North America, and we're going to focus on the years 1607 to roughly 1660. We're going to focus our attention spatially on the geographic areas of the Chesapeake and New England, the Chesapeake being in the southern part of North America's Atlantic coastline, and New England being in the northern part. And we're looking at those two areas because not only do they give us a glimpse into some of the earliest settlements and developments of colonies, but they also give us a glimpse into the diversity that existed in the English colonies as well. So we'll be taking a look at some of the motives that influenced and catalyzed this transatlantic migration and colonization. And as part of that examination, we'll be taking a look at statecraft, so how competition between these various European states like England and France and Spain influenced and sped up English colonization in North America. And then we'll also be taking a look at the actual people who came to settle in North America. Who were they? What were their motives? And how did they differ between those who were settling in the Chesapeake region and those in New England? And then we'll take a look at the people who were already here, the Native Americans. Just as we did under Spanish colonization and French and Dutch, we want to see how contact between these English settlers and the Native Americans impacted each group. And then lastly, we will take a look at the development of this concept of liberty in England. And we'll see how the state of political affairs and political unrest ultimately shaped and crafted this concept of liberty among Englishmen. And that idea of liberty and the idea of English people being the beacons of liberty for the world would influence the direction of life in North America. And ultimately, when we get to that point, how these colonists in North America view their relationship to the home country, to England itself. All right, so let's take a look at some of the subtopics for this lecture so that you have an idea on what we're going to be covering as we go through this lecture, as we go through the slides, and you can kind of use this as a rough outline for how to organize your notes. So we'll be looking at England and the New World, the coming of the English, or early settlement of North America. We'll look at the Chesapeake, how that is settled, who's arriving there, what their motives are. We'll look at New England and what their motives are and their way of life, and how that differs from the Chesapeake. We'll look at New Englanders divided. So we're going to see how views of politics and government and views of religion and the relationship between the two begin to divide New Englanders into different schools of thought. And then we're going to look at religion, politics, and freedom. Again, this concept of liberty and how it really comes to shape in the mid-1600s for Englishmen both in England and in North America. And just as in the last lecture, we'll begin each subtopic with a focus question to just kind of help us organize our notes and point them back to a larger theme. In this case, the question is, what were the main contours of English colonization in the 17th century? So what form did it take? What features do we find in English colonization? And what differences do we see between the Chesapeake and New England colonies? And do we find any similarities? These are the things that we want to look for as we go through this first subtopic. In the 16th century, England was just a second-rate power in Europe. It was weakened by these internal divisions that existed, especially those between the Catholics and the Protestants, that really came to a head once King Henry VIII launched the Protestant Reformation in England by severing the nation from the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England, or Anglican Church, with himself at its head, as opposed to the Pope over the Roman Catholic Church. Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled from 1558 to 1603, finally secured the power of the Anglican Church and successfully defended England from its Catholic enemies on the continent, notably the Spanish, whose attempt in 1588 to invade by a massive armada was repulsed. Well into the 1600s, the English also attempted to subdue Ireland and its Catholic population, in part through military conquest, the slaughter of civilians, the seizure of land, and introduction of English economic practices and colonization. The English expelled Irish Catholics from land to make room for Protestant settlements called plantations. Now, if you're already drawing a connection between that and what would take place in North America, then you're absolutely onto something, because the cultural practices and ideas that defined England's colonization of Ireland would end up shaping its conquest of North America. But instead of expelling Irish Catholics in North America, they were expelling Native Americans to make room for these English settlements. And where they established these plantations, in the southern colonies primarily, that would obviously make way for the introduction of forced labor. It begins with indentured servitude and ultimately ends with chattel slavery. Only under Queen Elizabeth's reign did the English look to North America, although at first they were more interested in raiding Spanish cities and treasure fleets than they were in colonization. The first two colonies in Newfoundland and what became North Carolina were small efforts that quickly failed. Humphrey Gilbert, who had earned a brutal reputation in the Irish Wars, established a short-lived settlement in Newfoundland, and Sir Walter Raleigh established a settlement a few years later at Roanoke Island. The first group of settlers at Roanoke abandoned the colony and returned to England. A second group, composed of families, disappeared by the time a ship returned to resupply the colony. With only the word Croatoan inscribed on a tree remaining, the colonists are assumed to have abandoned the settlement to live with the Indians. Raleigh, discouraged by the outcome and financially strained, now realized that additional planning and more financial resources than one person could provide were necessary for the successful establishment of a colony. As in the case of Spain, national glory, profit, and religious mission merged in early English thought about American colonization. The Reformation had solidified Catholic Spain as England's mortal enemy, a stance substantiated by victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. Spain claimed the spread of Catholicism as justification for colonization, and England claimed they were there to liberate the New World from the tyranny of the Pope. Atrocities were not confined to one imperial nation, but the notion that Spain was uniquely cruel was prominent. That idea allowed those such as Raleigh and Richard Hakluyt to pitch colonization to Queen Elizabeth I as an effort to free the New World from Spain, thus tying freedom and empire together. Both men, however, pointed out that glory and power were closely involved as well, because colonization could allow England to rival the larger continental powers. Other advocates of colonization argued that North America would absorb England's surplus population in a period of socioeconomic crisis and population growth. Colonization would therefore drain away the urban poor and peasants who'd been evicted from their own lands and the commons by the enclosures of large landlords. This is where landlords or landowners took all of these parcels of land that they had been subletting out to different individuals and families who were working those parcels of land and making their livings and surviving. And now these landlords or landowners took all of those parcels and brought them in and closed them into a larger tract of land to maximize the profit potential of the land that they owned. Well, when this happened, all of these people were evicted. They became homeless. They became poor and destitute. And English elites seemed to feel that not only were they a burden to society, but they actually threatened the social order and stability of England. Life was pretty bad for the poor and the homeless, for the unemployed. Under Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I, the unemployed could be whipped, they could be branded, they could be hanged, they could be forced to labor. So voluntary or involuntary immigration to the New World seemed an alternative that would simultaneously benefit the poor and the English nation. In turn, images of America such as that which appeared in Thomas More's Utopia promoted the New World as a place of wealth and opportunity where men could escape the hierarchies and inequalities of Europe, gain economic independence by owning their own land, and rule themselves. These images appealed to ordinary Englishmen and encouraged them to risk migration to America. And this was a risky venture. So the main lure for immigrants was not gold, but the promise of independence connected to owning land and the ability to pass that land on to children and descendants. Okay, so now that we have an idea of some of the social conditions that were underway, the socioeconomic strains and the population growth and how that contributed to English settlement, let's take a look at the next subtopic, which is the coming of the English. The focus question here is, what obstacles did the English settlers in the Chesapeake overcome? So like we've talked about already, emigration from England to America was risky. Diseases, internal religious, political, and economic tensions, and imperial wars and conflicts with Indians all threatened harm or death. Dependent on England for protection and economic aid, most settlements would have collapsed without such support and further emigration. Because economic conditions in England were so bad, more migrants in the 17th century, more than 500,000, left England than in France or Spain. Most of the English who came to North America were young single men from the lower ranks of English society, and they settled in the tobacco-producing colonies of Virginia and Maryland, where labor demand was high. Tobacco cultivation was very labor-intensive. So this is the area where most young single men headed because there was a need for them there, and this was the Chesapeake region. The rest settled in New England and the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Many of these people had already moved around the country in England, and emigration represented an extension of an increasingly mobile English lifestyle. Settlers who could afford their own passage arrived as free persons and soon acquired land. In the 1600s, however, most Englishmen arrived as indentured servants, who had voluntarily surrendered their freedom for a period of time, usually 5 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to America. Servants were as unfree as slaves in some ways. They could be bought and sold, could not marry without their owner's permission, were subject to physical punishments, and could not refuse to work. Unlike slaves, however, those servants who survived their term of labor, which wasn't many for most of the 17th century, eventually became free and received freedom dues. Sometimes that included land. But a high death rate and meager or unmet freedom dues meant the colonies were less appealing than anticipated for many. Now, this is important to note. Land for the English was the basis of liberty. It meant that men could control their own labor, they could control much of their own economic opportunity, and in most cases, owning land meant political participation. It meant that you could participate in voting. The English crown also awarded land grants, sometimes quite extensive, to relatives and allies. Because land was so plentiful and so many English migrants, both free and servant, came to America to gain land and the independence that came with it, property owners soon turned to African slaves as a labor force. So here's another important note. Liberty and slavery moved together in early English America. One was defined by the other. One was the absence of the other. Now, with all of this talk about the land that was available, readily available in large quantities for all these early settlers, it's important to note that obviously land in North America was already occupied. Far more settlers came to the English colonies than their Spanish and French counterparts, a circumstance that was disastrous for American Indian communities, and it provoked recurrent warfare. The English didn't call themselves conquerors, they didn't consider themselves conquerors, because they were more interested in land than they were in dominion. They didn't seek to rule or assimilate Indian populations, but rather to remove them from land desired by settlers. Some intermingling occurred in various circumstances, but most English settlers remained obstinately separate from their Indian neighbors. Officially, the English denied Indians rightful title to their lands because they did not cultivate or improve it, this obviously from a European perspective. In practice, colonial officials and settlers recognized occupancy as title and acquired land through purchase and forced treaties. While colonial governments attempted to regulate this process to keep the peace, few of their efforts were successful or enforced. English settlers' demand for additional land continued to increase exponentially. The English developed a strong sense of superiority over Indians, and as time went by made certain to keep boundaries between the two groups intact. The English would displace American Indian communities more thoroughly than any other empire. Though many Eastern Indians initially welcomed English settlers, particularly for the goods they introduced to native culture, such as cloth, metal tools, and guns, many Indians gradually came to resent the changes English colonization wrought in Indian life. We can catch a glimpse of this in the document we examined this week, wherein John Smith recollected an exchange that he had with Powhatan. And in reading that, we can sort of sense this duality in the perception of the English that Powhatan has, that Powhatan and his people have, where they see a value to maintaining good relations, and in some cases that's for trade purposes, but at the same time they also perceive this threat that the English people pose, and they resent that. But that threat wasn't just a threat of conquest, it was really a cultural threat. It was a threat to the Indians' way of life, because Indian men turned more to hunting beaver and fur trading, and older skills as a result fell into disuse with the appearance of English technologies. And then also alcohol became common and disruptive. As the colonists developed a military advantage over the Indians, profits from the fur trade flowed mostly to colonial and European merchants. English colonists also introduced diseases that led to devastating epidemics. English settlement transformed the land and its uses, threatened Indians' way of life through fencing, new crops, livestock like pigs and cattle which trampled Indian crops, and the depletion of forests to supply wood for the English domestic market. All right, so now let's look at settling the Chesapeake. How did Virginia and Maryland develop in the early years? We're looking at the contours of development, contours of colonization in the Chesapeake region. The first permanent English settlement in the New World was the Jamestown colony, founded in 1607 by the private Virginia Company. At first, the colony, intended as a means to discover gold or other precious minerals, was plagued by internal divisions, a high death rate, and few supplies from England. While colonists' hope for quick riches were soon dashed, few had any experience with agriculture, leading to starvation, which, when compounded by disease and illness, led to a high death rate. Few initial settlers survived the first year, and only military discipline imposed by a former soldier named John Smith saved the colony. To become viable and attract settlers, the Virginia Company stopped looking for gold, started to grow its own food and a marketable economy, and created an elected representative assembly. Under the headright system, the company awarded land to those who paid their own or others' passage, and the company issued a charter of grants and liberties, which included a House of Burgesses, the first elected assembly in colonial America, though again, remember, only landowners were eligible to vote. The arrival in 1619 of the first 20 blacks in Virginia marked, along with the meeting of the House of Burgesses that year, the conjoined development of freedom and slavery in English America. Thus, the foundation was laid for an economy dominated by slave-owning planters. The area where the English established Jamestown was inhabited by some 15,000 to 25,000 American Indians living in agricultural communities. Wahunsanakua, or Powhatan, was the recognized leader in the region and soon realized the advantages of trade with the English. Mindful of Las Casas' warnings about the Spanish Empire, the Virginia Company instructed colonists to treat indigenous inhabitants kindly and attempt to convert them to Christianity. John Smith realized that the colonists were dependent upon the Indians for food, and therefore attempted to negotiate in a way that kept trade open. The first 2 years were mostly peaceful. Smith was captured by Powhatan, threatened with execution, and rescued by the leader's daughter, Pocahontas. While legend portrays Pocahontas as a rebellious teenager in love, the incident was most likely an elaborate ceremony designed to demonstrate Powhatan's power. Relations deteriorated after Smith returned to England. Colonists massacred villagers indiscriminately, and Pocahontas was captured, only to convert to Christianity and marry John Rolfe as part of a peace settlement. She went to England with Rolfe and became a sensationalized representation of supposed Anglo-Indian harmony. She died of disease in 1617, and Powhatan died the following year. Sporadic fighting lasted between the Indians and the Jamestown colonists until 1614, but the peace declared that year was broken in 1622 by Powhatan's successor Opechancanough, whose surprise attack wiped out nearly 1/4 of Virginia's small settler population. Jamestown survivors retaliated by massacring scores of Indians and destroying their villages. The English now held the balance of power in the colony, and Virginia, which soon became the first royal colony of England, began to stabilize and slowly increase its population, in part by turning to the cultivation of tobacco. Opechancanough led a last attack in 1644, killing 500 colonists, but ultimately ending in defeat and leading to a treaty requiring Indians to leave the area. The policy of separation followed a precedent set in Ireland. With more Europeans smoking tobacco, the crop became a lucrative basis for the Virginia colony's survival and growth. Soon, a plantation elite with large estates emerged that ruled Virginia's society and politics, and they turned from unreliable and temporary white servant labor to black slave labor. Virginia's white society came to resemble that of England, with a landed gentry at top, small farmers in the middle, and an army of poor laborers, indentured servants and former servants without land, at the bottom. Given the demand for male servant labor in the tobacco fields, men at first vastly outnumbered women in the colony, and various factors contributed to late marriage and a low rate of family formation. Although women in Virginia, as in England, had few legal rights, conditions in the colonies gave women roles they could not assume in the mother country. Widows and unmarried women embraced their right to conduct business, make contracts, and even sometimes administer estates. But most white women arrived in Virginia as indentured servants, often subject to hard labor and even sexual abuse from their masters. While Maryland, like Virginia, was a tobacco colony, it was established later, in 1632, by King Charles I as the proprietary colony of Cecilius Calvert. Calvert ruled Maryland like a feudal domain, controlling its trade and the decisions of its elected assembly, despite the charter's guarantee giving ordinary Maryland colonists all the rights and privileges of Englishmen. Calvert, a Catholic, also saw Maryland as a refuge for persecuted fellow Catholics in England, and at first he hoped Catholics and Protestants could live there in harmony. But Protestants, mostly indentured or former servants, soon outnumbered Catholics, and their frustration mounted as they faced diminishing opportunities for land ownership in the latter half of the 17th century. Okay, so let's jump up the Atlantic coastline to New England. We're going to look at the New England way, and our focus question here will be what made the English settlement of New England distinctive. Whereas Virginia and Maryland quickly became societies dominated by a small aristocracy ruling over many bound laborers, New England colonial society evolved differently. Early New England was decisively shaped by the Puritans, a diverse group of English Protestants united by their belief that the Anglican Church retained too many of the practices and doctrines of the old Catholic Church. They mainly were Congregationalists, who rejected Catholic structures of religious authority retained in the Catholic Church, such as archbishops, bishops, and priests, and instead embraced independent local congregations that chose their own clergy, determined their mode of worship, and often listened to sermons and personally studied the Bible. Like many English and Anglicans, however, Puritans shared a hatred of Catholicism and celebrated England's greatness and devotion to liberty. As followers of John Calvin's theology, the Puritans believed God had predestined different groups of people, called the elect, to be saved from damnation. No amount of good deeds or good works could save those not among the elect. When a minority of Puritans in England separated from the Church of England, some Puritans decided to emigrate to America in order to fully practice their Protestant faith away from the influence and control of the Anglican Church and the English government that enforced its rules. One leader of the Puritan immigrants who settled in the Massachusetts Bay, John Winthrop, hoped to found a, quote, city set upon a hill, where Puritans would reject natural liberty, or actions without restraints that he believed were typically practiced by the Irish, Indians, and bad Christians, in favor of embracing a moral liberty to do that only which is good, in which Puritans became free by accepting severe restraints on speech, religion, and personal behavior. The first Puritan settlers to America, the Pilgrims, were separatists who left the Netherlands in 1620, financed by private investors interested in establishing a trading base in North America. The Pilgrims wanted to settle in Virginia, but their ship, the Mayflower, was blown off course and landed on Cape Cod. Before the survivors of the journey established the Plymouth colony there, they drew up the Mayflower Compact, in which all adult male colonists agreed to obey just and equal laws enacted by representatives of their own choosing. This was the first written frame of government in what became the United States. Resting on the consent of all members of the colony, their government did not restrict voting to church members, and all land was held in common until divided up in 1627. In 1691, this independent colony became an official crown colony of England. Although earlier visits by Europeans had brought diseases that devastated the local Indian population, local Indians, including the notable Squanto, helped the Puritans at Plymouth survive their first winter by offering them food, a relationship celebrated at the first Thanksgiving in 1621. Chartered in 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company was formed by London merchants hoping to further the Puritan cause and profit by trade with the Indians, and that year sent immigrants who settled in the Massachusetts Bay north of Plymouth. By 1642, a great migration of 21,000 Puritans had flowed to Massachusetts Bay, though migration to New England soon thereafter ceased altogether. Compared to colonists in the Chesapeake, settlers in New England were older, more prosperous, and more religious. Fewer New England colonists were servants, and here women were just as numerous as men, leading to more families than in the southern colonies. Although only a small fraction of migrants went to New England during the 17th century, by 1700 the white population was 91,000, larger than both the Chesapeake and the West Indies. Nearly all were descendants of those who crossed the Atlantic during the Great Migration. In New England, families and the patriarchal authority of the Puritan husband and father defined colonial society. These adult men controlled the labor of women and children in a farming society without large numbers of slaves or indentured servants. Though women were held to be spiritual equals to men and could become full members of the church, women were legally subservient to male authority in the home. The average New England woman married young, gave birth 7 times, and spent most of her life bearing and raising children. Puritans feared excessive individualism and social disorder, and organized themselves in small, compact, self-governing towns centered on a congregational church and eventually a school, mostly for reading the Bible, surrounded by small house and farming lots for individual families. The colony's government reflected this religious and social vision. The Massachusetts Bay Company's shareholders transformed their commercial charter into a government document, first choosing the colony's rulers, but in 1634 deputies elected by freemen, landowning church members, constituted a single legislature, the General Court. 10 years later, company officers and elected deputies were divided into 2 legislative houses, and unlike in Virginia or Maryland, freemen were able to elect their governor. The principle of consent was central to all of Puritan life, including church and state, but Puritan democracy, especially voting in colony-wide elections, was limited to members of the church, an even smaller number as the colony grew over time. A hierarchical society, families of social prominence were assigned the best land and most desirable seats in church. Divisions were also established in such areas as attire and language for addressing one another. Inequality was considered God's will. Some liberties applied to all, but separate ideas were applied to different groups, and the body of liberties allowed slavery, with the first slave appearing in the records in 1640. Ministers were not allowed to hold office, but church and state were closely connected. Each town was required to have a tax-supported church. Church courts were not established, but the state enforced religious matters. Freedom of speech and assembly were provided for, but straying from prescribed religious behavior held severe consequences, including the death penalty. Puritans believed religious uniformity to be vital to social order, and toleration of dissent disrupted that order. Religious liberty meant the liberty to structure society based on that notion. The desire of some congregations for local autonomy, however, soon clashed with notions of uniformity. Okay, so let's look at New Englanders divided. What were the main sources of discord in early New England? Although New England's Puritans respected individual judgment, they disdained individualism and considered too much emphasis on the self as dangerous to social harmony and stability. In the region's compact towns, residents monitored each other and punished or ostracized those who violated communal norms. Dissenters were not so much free to dissent as they were free to leave the Puritan community if they transgressed Puritan social and religious norms. Roger Williams, a dissenter, suggested that Massachusetts Bay should separate church and state, argued that its congregations should withdraw from the Anglican Church, and also rejected the conviction that Puritans were an elect people on a divine mission to spread the true Protestant faith. His intention was to strengthen rather than weaken religion, and he believed that government corrupted the purity of religion. So his view of separation of church and state, although he introduces this concept, was very different from what we now think about when we consider the separation of church and state. Most people today think of it as a way of preventing government from being influenced or corrupted by religion. In Roger Williams' time, his argument for the separation of church and state was the opposite. He didn't want church and state to be so closely intertwined because he was afraid government was going to corrupt or influence religion. For his dissenting views, Williams was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he and his followers founded Rhode Island as a result, which became a beacon of religious freedom, with no established church or religious qualifications for voting. Other religious dissenters went on to found the colonies of Hartford and New Haven, which in 1662 united as the colony of Connecticut. The Puritan establishment found one dissenter, Anne Hutchinson, particularly threatening for her gender and influence with other colonists. She argued that inner grace, not just church attendance and moral behavior, determined who could be a member of the saved Puritan elect. Denounced by church and state authorities for antinomianism, or the putting of one's own judgment or faith above human law and church teachings, Hutchinson was put on trial and banished from the colony. Her family moved to Rhode Island, where most of them died in an Indian war. But Hutchinson, Williams, and dissenters demonstrated that the Puritan belief in individual interpretation of the Bible could lead to challenging of the church structure. Many years passed before religious toleration became a part of Massachusetts society. The Puritans, who recognized Indians' claim to the land and sought to acquire it through purchase, also tended to see the Indians as savages and heathens, similar to Catholics in their deceptive rituals and worship of false gods. Afraid that undisciplined Indian life might attract some colonists, Puritan New Englanders hoped to prevent their fellow Englishmen from joining native tribes by passing punitive laws and publishing narratives of captivity promoting Christian life in the colony. Although the Puritans rhetorically advocated the conversion of Indians to Christianity, they initially made few efforts to do so. As the white population of New England increased, so did tensions with the region's Indians. In 1637, colonists responded to the murder of a fur trader by a few members of the Pequots, a powerful tribe in southern New England that controlled the fur trade, by destroying a Pequot village at Mystic, Connecticut, massacring more than 500 men, women, and children. The Pequots' defeat led to further white settlement in western New England and intimidated local Indians into quiescence for nearly 4 decades. Although Puritan leaders celebrated religion as their primary motive for emigrating to America, profit and prosperity were always central to many Puritans' decision to go to New England. Many were well off in England, but lived in economically depressed areas and sought opportunity in the New World, especially in the form of land ownership or a craft. While many New Englanders made a living by exporting fish and timber to Europe, most survived on subsistence family farming and the small surpluses this produced. Compared to the southern colonies, in New England there were few slaves and fewer indentured servants. Although New Englanders were not as wealthy as colonists in the Chesapeake region, wealth was distributed more equally than in Virginia or Maryland. But economic development was accompanied by social inequality, with a growing number of wage earners and a merchant elite profiting from an expansive trade in goods between the West Indies, Europe, and Africa. The economic growth and increasing commercialization worried some Puritan leaders, with fewer members of the Massachusetts colony being eligible for church membership. The Halfway Covenant of 1662 was designed to solve this problem by enabling third-generation Puritans, those least likely to have met the conversion standard of church membership, to become church members merely because they were descendants of original Puritan settlers. By the late 17th century, ministers were excoriating colonists for violations such as selfishness, pride, and violation of the Sabbath in lengthy sermons called Jeremiads. Okay, lastly, let's take a look at religion, politics, and freedom. And the focus question here is, how did the English Civil War affect the colonies in America? By 1600, the traditional view of English liberties as a set of privileges limited to certain social groups was competing with a notion that certain rights of Englishmen applied to everyone in the kingdom. This tradition rested on the Magna Carta of 1215, in which the king had given rights to all free men in England, including protection against arbitrary imprisonment and the seizure of property without the due process of law. Over time, this document came to signify a particularly English freedom, embodied in common law rights like habeas corpus and trial by jury, where the king was subject to the rule of law and all persons enjoyed security of person and property. As the serfdom characteristic of feudalism receded, more and more Englishmen were considered freeborn and entitled to these rights. Political and religious divisions within 17th century England heightened the meaning and importance of the concept of freedom both there in England and in the colonies. The struggle for political supremacy between Parliament and the Stuart monarchs James I and Charles I culminated in the 1640s in the English Civil War. Disputes over how and to what degree the Church of England should distance itself from Catholicism, and struggles over the respective powers of Parliament and the King, including the King's power to impose taxes without Parliament's consent, provoked a military conflict that ended in a victory for pro-parliamentary forces, the abolition of the monarchy, and the execution of King Charles I. The victors established a commonwealth and free state ruled by Oliver Cromwell that lasted almost a decade. In 1660, the monarchy was restored and Charles II assumed the throne. Political strife and upheaval in England in these years produced a rigorous debate about liberty that expanded the boundaries and definitions of freedom. The writer John Milton called for freedom of speech and of the press. Some religious groups emerged that called for universal Protestant toleration. A movement called the Levelers proposed a written constitution abolishing both the monarchy and the House of Lords, and extending the franchise, or the right to vote, to those without much property. A more radical group, the Diggers, advocated the common ownership of land. Though the Levelers and Diggers were quickly suppressed, some of their ideas were carried to America by English immigrants. Out of these struggles, English liberty, defining freedom as grounded in the common rights of all individuals in the English realm, became central to Anglo-American political culture. Thus, the English proudly distinguished their country, where individual rights and Parliament limited the king's power and authority, from the autocratic monarchies such as Spain, France, and Russia. The belief in freedom as a common English heritage, and the British Empire as the world's guardian of liberty, helped to legitimize colonization in the Western Hemisphere and cast imperial war against Catholic rivals as a struggle between freedom and tyranny. While most New Englanders sided with the Parliament in the 1640s, many Puritan leaders in the colonies were leery of the revolutionaries and the Commonwealth's tolerance for religious dissent. When followers of Anne Hutchinson became Quakers, a radical and spiritually egalitarian Protestant sect in England that defied Puritan doctrines, Massachusetts leaders tried to suppress them by banishment, whipping, and hanging. After the Restoration, Charles II reaffirmed the charter and ordered Protestant toleration. Executions ceased, but other efforts to suppress the Quakers continued. During the English Civil War, Virginia sided with Charles I and fell under Cromwell's control. In Maryland, the Civil War exacerbated pre-existing conflict between Catholic and Protestant settlers and anti-proprietary sentiment, feeding a civil war within that colony. Calvert stabilized Maryland and attracted more settlers by empowering Protestants in the colony's government and guaranteeing religious toleration for all Christians. Under Cromwell and the Commonwealth, England adopted aggressive policies to expand its colonies, promote Protestantism, and empower commerce in the British Isles and New World. Cromwell's army extended English control in Ireland, in the process massacring civilians, banning Catholicism, and seizing Catholics' lands. England also seized the valuable sugar island of Jamaica and passed the Navigation Acts in 1651, intended to challenge the commercial supremacy of the Dutch by limiting England's colonial trade to English ships and ports. Alright, and with that we'll conclude Lecture 2. Here's a quick preview of what to expect in the next chapter and the next lecture. And of course, as always, if you have any questions or need any additional support or clarification, please feel free to send me an email, or you can post your question to the coffee shop discussion board in Canvas to give your peers a chance to discuss the content with you.